I have here an excellent critique, in my opinion, of the Kids Online Safety Act by Senator Ron Paul. I don't always agree with his takes, but I respect him. And I also agree with him that this is a law that had good intentions, but is way, way too vague. Not only that, well, we'll get to it when we get to it. There are many, many problems with this bill, and I really hope it does not come to pass. Let's start here. I have no doubt the authors of this bill genuinely want to protect children, but the bill they've written promises to be a Pandora's box of unintended consequences. The Kids Online Safety Act would impose an unprecedented duty of care on internet platforms to mitigate certain harms associated with mental health, such as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. While proponents of the bill claim that the bill is not designed to regulate content, imposing a duty of care on internet platforms associated with mental health can only lead to one outcome: the stifling of First Amendment protected speech. It's basically saying, if you tell social media platforms that they are responsible for the well-being of kids that browse their platforms, then they will simply remove anything that they could be sued over. They would be overjealous about it because they are afraid of being sued, essentially. And I think he's right. Let's go down a bit and continue from here. The bill effectively empowers the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to regulate content that might affect mental health. Yet it does not explicitly define the term mental health disorder. Instead, it references the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, or the most current successor edition. Written that way, not only would someone looking at the law not know what the definition is, but even more concerning, the definition could change without any input from Congress whatsoever, essentially giving a blank check to this manual writer, the writers of this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. They can claim that literally anything is causing a mental health problem in kids, and then talking about that thing would become prohibited, forbidden. The scope of one of the most expansive pieces of federal tech legislation could drastically change overnight, and Congress may not even realize it until after it already happened. None of the people's representatives should be comfortable with a definition that effectively delegates Congress's legislative authority to an unaccountable third party. This is a very good point. Since when do we allow bureaucrats or experts to legislate? It is the duty of Congress. It is their sole prerogative. Second, it says here, the bill would impose an unprecedented duty of care on internet platforms to mitigate certain harms, such as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. But the legislation does not define what is considered harmful to minors, and everyone will have a different belief as to what causes harm, much less how online platforms should go about protecting minors from that harm. The sponsors of the bill will tell you that they have no desire to regulate content, but the requirement that platforms mitigate undefined harms belies the bill's effect to regulate online content. Imposing a duty of care on online platforms to mitigate harm associated with mental health can only lead to one outcome: the stifling of constitutionally protected speech. I say he's very correct. He's talking here about how climate anxiety is a thing. Harvard had a story about it. And he's talking about how Greta Thunberg, who is the world's most well-known climate activist, I'd say he's correct, and she suffers from climate anxiety. Should platforms stop her from seeing climate-related content because of that? Well, under this bill, you could potentially say that that's exactly what is required legally. Under this bill, Greta Thunberg would have been considered a minor, and she could have been deprived from engaging online in a debate that made her famous. Anxiety and eating disorders are two of the undefined harms that this bill expects internet platforms to prevent and mitigate. Are those sites going to allow discussion and debate about the climate? Are they even going to allow discussion about a person's story of overcoming an eating disorder? No. Instead, they are going to censor themselves and users rather than risk liability. Exactly what I said. Nobody's going to risk liability if they can help it, even if it means that they will have to censor, especially if they already want to censor. With all sorts of vague guidelines on social media, I'm not talking about anyone in particular, YouTube, then this gives them the perfect excuse to be heavy-handed. Part of online discussion of sexuality. Would pro-gay or anti-gay discussion cause anxiety in teenagers? What about pro-life messaging? Could pro-life discussions cause anxiety in teenage mothers considering abortion? In truth, this bill opens the door to nearly limitless content regulation, as people can and will argue that almost any piece of content could contribute to some form of mental health disorder. In short, this is an excuse to censor. We have been having so many problems with social media platforms and governments censoring and censoring, governments calling and forcing even legally platforms to censor. And this is basically, think of the children who now censor everything. You can say that anything is causing, in fact, you could say that misogyny. I've just seen people talking about how the UK is calling misogyny a terrorist, having or holding misogynistic opinions or stating misogynistic opinions a terrorist act. Well, anyone who is critical of the way women behave in modern society, for example, might find himself censored because he might be creating bad opinions in kids, causing them mental harm. Congratulations, you are now censored. Almost anything could be considered harmful to kids and forbidden. And definitely opinions that are anti-establishment are the most vulnerable to this. The whole reason we needed freedom of speech was to protect opinions that go against the mainstream or opinions that go against those in power. If we can just say, in the name of the safety of the children, shut up, we won't be democracies for much longer. There's another interesting point here. This bill does not merely regulate the internet, it threatens to silence important and diverse discussions that are essential to a free society. And who is empowered to help make these decisions? That task is entrusted to a newly established speech police. This bill would create a Kids Online Safety Council to help the government decide what constitutes harm to minors and what platforms should have to do to address that harm. These are the types of decisions that should be made by parents and families, not unelected bureaucrats serving a censorship committee. I have nothing more to add, honestly. This is just a very obvious problem with the bill. These are not the only deficiencies of this bill. The bill seeks to protect minors from beer and gambling ads on certain online platforms, such as Facebook or Hulu. But if these same minors watch the Super Bowl or the PGA Tour on TV, they would see those exact same ads. Does that make any sense? Should we prevent online platforms from showing kids the same content they can and do see on TV every day? Should sports viewership be effectively relegated to the pre-internet age? This is hypocrisy to the highest degree. But that's not even the worst problem with this bill. I think the worst problem is something that he's discussing a bit later on. And it's here, I believe, right? Yes, that means the media platforms who earnestly try to comply with the law could be punished because the government thinks it should have known a user was a minor. It's a continuation, but you understand the context, right? This bill does not just apply to minors. It should have been standard. That's the standard. I should probably read that back, right? Sorry. So it says here that the bill requires websites to treat differently individuals that the platform knows or should know are minors. Right. So everything I just said is based on this sentence. The bill does not apply just to minors. It should have been standard means that the bill is an internet-wide regulation, which effectively means that the only way to comply with the law is for platforms to verify ages. So adults and minors alike better get comfortable with providing a form of ID every time they go online. This knowledge standard destroys the notion of internet privacy. Sorry. This is, in my opinion, the largest, most glaring problem with this bill. There have been authoritarian forces trying to strip online anonymity and impose a digital ID for years now, and this effort has reached a crescendo recently. I'm talking about the last year or two. They want to centralize all of your medical data, all of your records, your bank account, everything in one place, so that it would become exceedingly easy to punish you for everything that you say in real time, everything that you say and do in real time. Whenever you say or do something that disagrees with the government policy or ideology, you would be open to retaliation in many, many different ways, because all aspects of your life will be governed from one point. Also, the risk of this database being hacked and all of your records being in the hands of basically anyone who is willing to pay for it is rather high. Government entities and large corporations are hacked all the time. Think about how much harm could come from somebody that has all of your medical data, or from somebody that has all of your movements being tracked through your phone. We are not ready as a society to deal with this, and we shouldn't be, because this should not happen in the first place. There is no need for a centralized form of overwhelming data about you personally, about individuals personally. We don't have a cause to create this vulnerability. In fact, it's bad on all aspects. And this bill is just another attempt to sneak it in without having a proper discussion about it. It's just implied. Nobody's stating, hey, we need an online ID, digital ID right now, let's have a national debate about it in any country. Not in the UK, not in the EU, not in Canada or Australia, anywhere. We're just going to create a bill that requires a digital ID to function, and then we'll create it out of the need for it, without telling you that we're doing it and without your consent. If we read a little further, he says here, I have raised several questions about this bill, but no one, not even the sponsors of the legislation, can answer those questions honestly, because they do not know the answer. They do not know how overzealous regulators or state attorneys will enforce the provisions in this bill. They do not know what rules the FTC may come up with to enforce its provisions. The inability to answer those questions is the result of several vague provisions of this bill, and once enacted into law, these questions will not be answered by the elected representatives in Congress. They will be answered by bureaucrats who are likely to empower themselves at the expense of our First Amendment rights. That is very true. Bureaucrats always strive for more power, and we are seeing the rise of the technocracy. Basically, the further away someone from you in government, the worse they will govern. If you are directly electing someone, then he is closest to you, because you essentially have a say in who it is. An unelected bureaucrat is just about the least accountable to you. Something in the middle is, for example, someone that you do not directly elect but can at least influence somewhat. The European Union, for example, has many bodies that are governed through the people elected in the state. Indirectly, really. All sorts of commissions and such. They're not directly elected. Let's say you're not the British public electing your prime minister and he makes the rules, or your Congress, your House of Representatives, and they make the rules. But you send delegates to the European Union, and they are part of a larger body that makes the rules for your country as well. I think this is sort of indirect democracy. It's worse than direct democracy, but still better than ruled by fiat, ruled by bureaucrats and technocrats. If we continue a bit more, it says here there are good reasons to think that the courts will strike down this bill. They would have a host of reasons to do so. Vagueness pervades this bill. The most meaningful terms are undefined, making compliance with the bill nearly impossible. Even if we discount the many and obvious First Amendment violations inherent in this bill, the courts will likely find this bill void for vagueness. But we should not rely on the courts to save America from this poorly drafted bill. The Senate should have rejected it and forced the sponsors to at least provide greater clarity. The Senate, however, was dedicated to passing the bill despite its deficiencies. And that's kind of worrying. The whole problem here, I think, is that there are very powerful forces in government all over the world that are pushing for this sort of legislation. This is not a mistake. This is not happenstance. This is part of a larger agenda. Basically, it feels as though the people that are part of the Union Party all over the world are funded by the same people, BlackRock, Vanguard, and the like. They go to the same meetings, mostly in Davos, the World Economic Forum, and they mingle together, they share their opinions, and they come up with a specific plan that they all mostly agree on and enact. Which is why America became so important for me despite me not living in it. It's the world superpower, and if it falls to their machinations, small countries like mine will have a very hard time not going along with the flow. This is bigger than most countries, and the amount of influence my vote has on my country, I think, diminished quite a bit. Policies enacted at a global level, and my ability to resist it is rather meager. I really hope that Americans strike down this bill and do not vote for people who would repeat mistakes like these, would not vote for people who would enact a technocratic agenda that's contrary to freedom of speech and democracy. And I hope people like Rand Paul will continue to be a strong voice against problems like these, because we desperately need some. There are very few of them in governments all over the place, and most of them are demonized. If you try to be a voice for freedom of speech today on the internet, you are demonized and shunted aside, dismissed, and censored. Something that might give you some hope, let's conclude on a positive note, is this. Opposition to this bill is bipartisan, from advocates on the right to the left. A pro-life organization, Students for Life Action, commented on this bill, stating, "Once again, a piece of federal legislation with broad powers and vague definitions threatens pro-life speech. Those targeted by a weaponized federal government will almost always include pro-life Americans defending mothers and their children, born and preborn." But on the other hand, we have the ACLU, brought more than 300 high school students to Capitol Hill to urge Congress to vote no on this bill, because, to quote the ACLU, which is a very left-wing organization, "it would give the government the power to decide what content is dangerous to young people, enabling censorship and endangering access to important resources like gender identity support, mental health materials, and reproductive health care." So people on both sides of the aisle are opposing it. They're afraid of what it would be like to live under a government that disagrees with them and has the powers contained in this bill. I really hope we see a bipartisan pushback that will result in this bill falling through. What do you think about it? Are you for or against? Do you think this is a specific problem this time around, or something that is part of a larger agenda? Comment and let me know. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.